As pessoas... Pode ir?
Sim.
Olá, caros alunos, boa noite. Good evening, everyone. I will say some words in English, and I will ask Vinicius. I don't need to translate, Vinicius. I will say some words in English, and then I will say the same words in Portuguese. It's a pleasure to have Laura here with us. So, on behalf of the Department of International Relations, I would like to welcome Professor Laura and express our gratitude for her presence to give our inaugural lecture of the first semester of 2022, entitled Narrating the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, Logics of Global Governance. It's an honor and a great opportunity to be listened to her on such an important and dear topic to our department's agenda, as well as the global agenda. While, especially nowadays, while we witness the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, this topic becomes even more pressing. Daily, events involve women going to the front, being sexually abused, and seeking refuge for themselves and their children. These are only some of the many roles that we, women, might assume in the face of violence, and some of the many ways in which we engage with the peace and security agenda. I would like to register that we do not shy away from the fight, but we also do not want to let our bodies be assaulted by it. So, Laura, I would like to say again, many thanks to have you here with us, and many thanks to all of you here tonight. Now I will pass the floor to Professor Vinicius, who will chair tonight's session. Good evening for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara.
So, agora vou falar em português para os meninos? Você acha que é necessário? Né? Porque o meu inglês pode ser tão ruim, né? Que ninguém entendeu. Então, meus caros alunos, boa noite, muito obrigada pela presença. Estou falando aqui de Belo Horizonte, sou a chefe de Departamento de Relações Internacionais e, por isso, hoje estou tomando a palavra, mas gostaria de deixar registrado, e essa parte eu esqueci de falar em inglês, né? Nervosia tão grande, mas que bom que eu estou aqui juntamente com o professor Péricles Pedrosa, coordenador aí do curso de Poços, com a professora Daniela Sestes, coordenadora da nossa unidade da Praça da Liberdade. E então, né, resumidamente, o que eu quis dizer, eu não vou lembrar exatamente, né, tudo que foi falado, é que no momento tão oportuno como hoje, onde estamos assistindo, a figura, pela primeira vez, eu acho, a gente está vendo como que a mulher está sendo noticiada de uma forma presente, né, de uma forma rotineira dos noticiários da guerra. Então, ontem mesmo estavam falando de alguns refugiados e eles fizeram uma tomada de carrinhos de bebês deixados numa estação de trem para aquelas refugiadas ucranianas que estivessem carregando o seu bebê. Então, eu que já acompanhei a invasão, nós dois, né, Félix, você deve lembrar bem da invasão do Iraque no Kuwait, né? Foi meu primeiro conflito, né? 93, na verdade, né? Quando o Iraque invadiu o Kuwait. Né?
Sim.
Não, foi 91, na verdade, 91, o Golfo, a Guerra do Golfo.
Sim,
e eu lembro que eu recortava notícias da Folha de São Paulo, mas a mulher não existia. E hoje a gente vê a mulher indo para o fronte, a mulher sendo abusada sexualmente e a mulher fugindo, né, tentando proteger seus filhos. nós mulheres, né, uma só podendo ser tantas. E tantas mulheres falando do conflito, né, Daniela? A professora Daniela está aí em todas as mídias, atendendo à imprensa. Então, passo a palavra ao professor Vinícius. Professor Laura, and now, again, thank you very much for your presence here with us today. We are very glad of this. So, good night for all.
Thank you, Chiara. Obrigada. Bom, pessoal, I'll speak in Portuguese just to begin this part, Lara. Nós já falamos, né, mas vou só falar aqui um pouco sobre o currículo da professora, né? Então, a professora Laura Shepherd é professora de Relações Internacionais na Universidade de Sydney, na Austrália. A sua pesquisa principal se concentra na agenda Mulher, Paz e Segurança, do Conselho de Segurança das Nações Unidas e nas questões de gênero, violência e segurança. A Laura é autora e editora de vários livros, incluindo mais recentemente esse que nós vamos discutir aqui, Narrating the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, Logics of Global Governance, e New Directions in Women, Peace and Security. Ela também tem, como vocês já viram, ela tem contas em redes sociais, vocês podem seguir, a gente destacou lá no nossos posts, né? Nós vamos proceder da seguinte forma: aqueles e aquelas que tiverem dúvidas podem colocar no chat. Quem quiser fazer a pergunta em português pode ficar à vontade, nós vamos traduzir para a Laura. Ela vai ter esse primeiro momento, vocês podem ir tomando nota, produzindo as suas perguntas, e depois, na hora que ela finalizar, nós vamos abrir para discussão, para as perguntas. O YouTube ele tem um limite de caracteres, então fiquem atentos a isso quando vocês forem postar as perguntas. Bom, então eu acho que é isso. Eu agradeço novamente a professora Chiara, a professora Daniela, o professor Péricles, pela parceria de sempre. Eu acho que ter a Laura, né, vai ser um momento muito engrandecedor para todos nós. Então, agradeço a todas e todos e boa palestra, boa conversa para todos nós nessa noite. Noite para nós, dia na Austrália. So, Laura, I want to thank you again for your availability to talk with us. I will give the floor to you right now, and it is a bit weird because when you talk, we're going to highlight you, so it will feel like you're talking to nobody, but right now there's like 189 people watching, so it is a very pleasure to have you. So if you please, you may have the floor. Then we have the Q&A section and debate, so you feel free.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your very generous welcome. And it's a real honor to be connecting with you and talking to you today. I have some slides. I would like to share my screen. So I'm hoping that I'm able to do that with this technology. Maybe that's not going to work. Perhaps what I'll do is just go ahead and deliver my talk, and we can live without the slides. So I wanted to first of all acknowledge today that I am connecting in from the stolen lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Sovereignty was never ceded to this land. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I pay my respects to elders past and present and thank them for their custodianship of country. It's a very important part of acknowledging the colonial history of Australia and acknowledging the ongoing dispossession and violence faced by the Indigenous people of Australia, the Aboriginal Australians. So I want to thank you for bearing with me while I pay my respects and acknowledgements. And I also want to, again, thank everybody involved in organizing this event. It's a huge honor to be connecting with you and to give you the inaugural address of your new seminar, of your new semester. So I'm really, as I say, very delighted to be here. I'm going to talk today about a book that I published last year with Oxford University Press. The book was part of a larger project funded by the Australian Research Council called Women, People and Security, Rethinking Policy, Advocacy and Implementation. Now, this project was related, like much of my research, to a set of UN Security Council resolutions that have been adopted under the title of Women and Peace and Security. So they form what's known as a thematic agenda within the United Nations Security Council. Since the passage of the first Women, Peace and Security, or WPS resolution in 2000, there have been 9 further resolutions, the most recent of which was adopted in October 2019. So we now have 10 WPS resolutions governing the gender dimensions of peace and security. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the provisions and principles of the WPS agenda are usually grouped into 4 pillars. The first of these is the participation of women in peace and security governance. The second is the protection of women's rights and bodies in conflict and post-conflict situations. The third is the prevention of violence, including both the prevention of violent conflict in line with a kind of anti-militarist strand of the agenda, and then also the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. The fourth and final pillar of the WPS agenda is known as relief and recovery, which demands gender-sensitive humanitarian programming in the wake of disasters and complex emergencies, as well as the inclusion of women in post-conflict reconstruction and peace-building related activities. So in addition to the Security Council resolutions that form the policy architecture of the agenda, we've seen the development of a host of additional materials, protocols, guidance, and national action plans supporting the implementation of the agenda across a wide variety of contexts. So it is a really diverse and proliferating policy ecosystem involving numerous actors, institutions, and experts. So my book is about one small dimension of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. It focuses on the stories that are told about the agenda, specifically those that are told by people working on women, peace and security around and within the United Nations headquarters in New York. And I focus on the ways in which those stories create particular knowable realities, making possible certain actions and outcomes while proscribing others. So as I said, the book was only published sort of in the middle of last year. So I'm still waiting for reviews and other kinds of commentary with the usual combination of excitement and trepidation. But I'm very excited to hear what you make of the research that I'm going to present here today. So in the book, I blend narrative and discourse theory to analyze the stories of the WPS agenda, examining the arrangement of discourse in the formation of particular stories. And the core argument that I make is that the form of these stories is structured through 4 powerful logics: a logic of incoherence, a logic of impossibility, a logic of dislocation, and an ambivalent logic of practice. So these logics, I argue, are intrinsically plural, resisting closure. So it is both coherence and incoherence, both possibility and impossibility. Whereas a singular logic of coherence would tend towards organizing discourses that reproduce the agenda as whole and integrated, and where conversely a logic of incoherence would tend towards organizing discourses that reproduce the agenda as multiple and disintegrating. The argument that I make in the book is that both of these logics simultaneously structure the discourses that comprise the narratives of the WPS agenda. So these logics are not either or, they're both and. And in the same way, a logic of possibility would tend to structure the narratives of the agenda according to its representation as manageable and operationalizable, whereas impossibility renders its opposites. But both are evident, both are true in the stories of WPS that I recount. The logic of dislocation produces the space and place of the agenda on the one hand, situating or homing the agenda in New York and at the UN, but on the other hand, reproducing its projection elsewhere to spaces and places beyond and outside the elite institutions of global governance. And this relates to, but is not exhausted by, what I refer to as the ambivalent logic of practice. It's ambivalent because it structures the attachment of radically different values to the concept of practice. Literally, its valence or its emotional register is both good, representing authenticity, experience, and credibility, and bad, subordinate to formal knowledge, expertise, and authority. So these four sets of logics are evident in and resonate across the diverse and disparate discourses that I identify within which the agenda is narrated. These logics have a plurality that cannot be reconciled, and together they produce and structure the imaginable futures of the agenda, as well as that which is unimaginable from this perspective. The irreconcilability of these plural or ambiguous logics precludes the realization of the agenda as a singular, essential thing in the world. As I show in the analysis I present, much energy and resource is expended in efforts to reduce or resolve the agenda to a singular, essential thing with a singular, essential meaning. But the argument that I present implies that those seeking to realize the WPS agenda, to live up to the principles which are encapsulated within it, might need to live with this irreconcilability, the irresolvable and the ambiguous. So this thesis is developed through an analysis of a data set of documents, which includes 10 Security Council resolutions, which I already mentioned, 15 presidential statements issued by the Security Council between 2001 and 2016, 28 reports by the Secretary General on the topic of women, peace and security, 41 open debates at the Security Council that incorporated statements or testimony from UN actors and various civil society representatives, and the transcripts of 24 extensive unstructured interviews that I undertook with UN staff and civil society actors working on and with the WPS agenda in New York. So the organization of the analysis into thematic chapters derived from preliminary engagement with the data. These broad themes were origins of the agenda, successes, obstacles and limitations, tensions and points of contestation, and the barely hidden, the articulated or obscured. So my interpretation of the data is no doubt shaped and influenced by my own WPS stories. The first time I went to New York to try to talk to UN staff and civil society actors about the Women, Peace and Security agenda was in July 2013. The contrast between the humid, crowded city streets and the quiet cool of the overly air-conditioned offices was deeply disconcerting. The entire experience, honestly, was disconcerting and so different to the bloodless and prim description of the research process that I had outlined in the grant application that funded my presence there. I remember being overwhelmed and overawed and also mildly affronted by my own abiding sense that I didn't really belong in those spaces. Visiting again many times in the years that have passed between then and now, visiting the same people and the same offices, although not necessarily in the same configurations as people move around from post to post, from organization to organization, while remaining in the general orbit of WPS work. I feel the same but different, an insider, outsider. I feel I can claim some expertise in this area, some occasional, partial, provisional insider status after many years of research on WPS. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and I've spent nearly 20 years working on and with this resolution and those that came after. I've written many articles and a couple of books, and I've traveled back and forth from Sydney to New York many, many times, growing increasingly, though never completely comfortable, with navigating those bureaucratic and institutional spaces that are held and animated by the WPS agenda. and I have listened to hours and hours of WPS stories. I've learned so much from these stories. I've learned the language of women, peace and security, the significant dates, the acronyms, the alliances and antagonisms. I've learned how meaningful a pause can be, or a raised eyebrow in the recounting of an event or experience. I've learned the power of the knowing nod as a response to the phrase that begins, well, of course, you know, of course, and I nod. I've learned what's taken for granted in WPS circles in New York, what is and is not featured in their shared history, what counts as common sense among these clever, committed, and altogether human advocates for the agenda. Fundamentally, I've learned how central storytelling is to the research process, to my own understanding, and the development of a shared understanding of what the agenda has been, is, and could be. So the driving theoretical claim in this book is that the stories that are told about the WPS agenda have profound and constitutive effects regarding how the agenda is apprehended, encountered, and acted upon. In the introduction to the book, I explore the idea that storytelling is a political practice and a fundamentally human practice. We learn from stories, from the ways in which stories are told, and we are in turn constituted through the stories we tell. In the context of this investigation, which explores the narration of the WPS agenda at the headquarters of United Nations in New York, the stories that are told about the agenda are also constitutive of WPS as a knowable policy artifact in world politics. Moreover, the specific ways in which the agenda is narrated function to hold open the meaning of the agenda, to resist or in fact make impossible the closure of the agenda around a single and stable meaning, and this shapes and informs the possible futures. Narratives represent events or experiences. The communicative act of narration composes elements of discourse into particular formations, such that sense or meaning can be made of those elements. Although story and narrative are often used interchangeably in writing, it may be conceptually useful to think of them as somewhat distinct and to posit a relationship between narrative and story that sees narrative as a story, a sequenced account or representation of event or experience rendered in discourse. Story, on this view, is the arrangement of discourse that is told within a narrative. Narrative exceeds story. The organization of discourse in service of story, and perhaps the production of story through discourse, can therefore be thought of as a process of stabilization. Discourses coalesce into the particular story formation of a recognizable and communicable narrative. So the way that I have come to understand narratives is that they can be apprehended and analyzed as sticky arrangements of discourse, as assemblages or partially or temporarily fixed configurations that cohere over time to present a story. And I have found this idea that narrative is storified discourse with a particular function to be a productive foundation for analytical engagement with narrative. Stories are, of course, always partial and necessarily exclude much in their telling. If there is a single unifying dimension of narrative as a form of communication, it might be that narratives cannot represent an event or experience in its totality. The process of representation through narrative or any other mode of communication is always a selective process. The shape and form of narrative, therefore, is always political. The organization of event or experience into story is composed of representational practice, of discourse. The concept of discourse, when considered in relation to story as part of narrative analysis, brings to the surface of analytical inquiry the relations of power that structure what Jennifer Millikan calls meaning in use. My research uses a Foucauldian concept of discourse, wherein all forms of communication and symbolism represent some kind of claim to know or to order social life. And so all communicative or symbolic acts are recognizable as discursive practices. Analysis of these discursive practices can show how subjects and objects emerge as known and knowable. and how the discourse in question creates relational chains of meaning between these subjects and objects such that they are known and knowable in particular ways, according to particular logics. So the other concept that I'm working with then is the concept of logics. And I argue that logics organize a discourse and produce, through the process of signification, the overarching semblance of fixity that allows for the expression of the known or the knowable. These logics are never predetermined, and it is in fact part of the ethos of discourse analysis that the taking apart of discourse is always a project of radical possibility. Because discourse analysis is motivated by a desire to show the processes through which meaning is constructed, it simultaneously shows how the construction of meaning itself is contingent and thus changeable. Such an approach is a way of laying bare or excavating the logics of a text that create coherence and authority, and of surfacing the instabilities and tensions within the text. The idea that discourses are held together by logics is of central importance in this research. Logics are frequently assumed or forced to be singular, reducible to one side or another of a binary opposition. Different logics of security, for example, take either the state or the human as the referent objects. And different logics of gender construct masculine subjects as either aggressors or protectors. Although, of course, these are intertextually articulated with other discourses and logics, for example, those that constitute some masculine subjects as aggressors and some as protectors. The way I use logics here, however, takes inspiration from Cynthia Weber's work on queer logics of statecraft and resists the disclosure or fixity of privileging one side of the dichotomy over the other. Thus, the logics I identify are plural and not singular. The political affordances of the plural logics I identify and the discourses they sustain are similarly plural. These logics produce and structure the imaginable and unimaginable futures of the agenda. To quote Cynthia Weber, they produce new institutions, new structures of understanding, and new practical orientations that are paradoxically founded upon a disorientating and or reorientating plurality, end quote. Critically, these logics and discourses can be mobilized in support of both the status quo configuration of power relations and their radical reconfiguration. Through resisting reconciliation to a singular logic or a series of singular logics, the logics I identify introduce what Weber calls a kind of systematic, non-decidable plurality into the discourses that I analyze. And these in turn are held in sticky arrangement to form the narratives of the women, peace and security agenda. The stories that are told reproduce these undecidable logics and refuse attempts at reducing the agenda to a singular thing. The plurality and multiplicity creates forms of political possibility and also shows how to apprehend the emergence of WPS as a knowable policy agenda through its narratives. And this is to situate oneself in relation to the intrinsic ambiguity of its constitution. Turning now to the substances of these narratives, as I mentioned earlier, I identified 5 elements of the story of WPS at UN headquarters. First, there are the origin stories. One of the most prominent motifs in the data that I've collected is a repeated and repeatedly coherent narrative of the history of the agenda, which tells of the advocacy surrounding the adoption of Resolution 1325 in the year 2000, and anchors the agenda firmly in the passage of this resolution by the UN Security Council. The narration of this origin story is of critical importance in shaping what the agenda could and would become in the intervening 20 years. The ownership of the agenda by the women's civil society organizations that lobbied for the adoption of the foundational resolution is a touchstone of political activism around the agenda and has had an impact on the development of the agenda over the past 2 decades. In particular, the reiterated attribution of authority over the agenda to women civil society organizations has sustained the involvement of those organizations in ritualized celebrations of the agenda. For example, in the annual open debates at the Security Council on this theme. In terms of the futures of the agenda, the power of this narrative renders it almost unthinkable that women civil society organizations would be excluded from women, peace and security practices at the UN, and further unlikely that ownership claims made by and on behalf of these organizations would be disputed. These ownership claims, deriving from the origin stories, thus have important constitutive effects on the futures of the agenda and on the legitimacy and credibility of various WPS subjects. The stories of the origins of the agenda and its ownership is constructed through three particularly prominent discourses. First, there is a discourse about the agenda's significance, which draws together dimensions of discourses of place and space to construct a situatedness for the agenda that is both at, in, and beyond the UN Security Council. This discourse is structured by logics of dislocation and an ambivalent logic of practice. Second, there is a discourse of interconnectedness, or its preclusion. On the one hand, opening up the agenda through the articulation of its connection to numerous other policy platforms and conventions. But on the other hand, there is a conservative impulse to constrain the agenda to the text of the UN Security Council resolutions alone. Connecting to articulations of the history and heritage of the agenda, and of Resolution 1325 in particular, the invocation of other policy platforms and conventions in the context of WPS storytelling both creates links across diverse fields of practice and can act as a mechanism through which the agenda is strengthened and legitimized. It also, however, functions to constrain the agenda within a narrow field of associated policy frameworks. Through my analysis, I show how these discourses are underpinned by logics of incoherence and coherence, possibility and impossibility. Third, and relatedly, there is a discourse of completeness. This is discourse about the comprehensive coverage of the agenda, its full and complete codification in the UN Security Council resolutions, versus the impetus to extend the agenda to include emerging and new security issues relevant to the agenda. I identify in this discourse the ambivalent of logic of practice, in the disconnection between the agenda on paper and the agenda in practice. And this logic is reinforced and interwoven with logics of dislocation, impossibility, and incoherence. The second narrative conveys the successes of the agenda. Here, I interrogate the emergence of the agenda as a triumph of transnational advocacy, a step forward in the seemingly endless search for strategies to mitigate against gendered inequalities and discrimination, and the prompt for or ally of related policy initiatives, such as the UK's Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative or the feminist foreign policy commitments of Sweden and Canada. Multiple articulations of success feature in the narrative of the agenda. For the purpose of recounting the story, I organize these into two primary dimensions. First, the narration of the WPS agenda frequently cites the agenda itself as a success. This narrative element relates the emergence of and consolidation of the agenda and its rise to prominence as a framework for governance as a success, in line with the narration of the origin story. The repeated narration of the agenda as evidence of its own success is not only tautological, but also reinforces the idea that the agenda can unproblematically be depicted as an ongoing struggle to provide structure to and secure visibility for gendered harms in conflict and conflict-affected settings. This, of course, creates discursive space for continued elaboration of an opposing position that performs ongoing resistance to the agenda at the national or international level. The second dimension of the success story is the narration of moderate successes in implementation. These are moments of change and, by implication, improvement to organizational structure or individual experience that the agenda has brought about. Over time, the ways in which these victories are presented, particularly in the Secretary General's reports, but also in contributions and statements to Security Council open debates, and even in the interviews I conducted, relies more and more on quantitative data and relates increasingly to the prevention of sexual violence and women's participation in peace processes, while other dimensions of the agenda are much less well attended. The narrative identified here is comprised of three prominent discourses. There is discourse about the anniversary effect of the institutional celebration of the adoption of Resolution 1325 each year in October. The effect and marking of this anniversary reinforces the logics of location and dislocation and the ambivalent logic of practice that I introduced. The second discourse I identify here relates to the concept of moderation, and I characterize this as a discourse of little wins. The diminution of success limits the possibilities afforded by the discourse making up the story of success, and this discourse is thus structured by logics of possibility and impossibility, in that each win is undermined by the elements left unrealized, the aspects of the agenda yet unwon. The final discourse imbricated in the success story is a discourse of leverage, both transnationally across the institution of the UN and nationally, as the agenda is used by women's organizations to pressure national governments to achieve particular advocacy and lobbying objectives. The logics of location and dislocation are evident here, as the agenda is represented as belonging in and to both of these spaces simultaneously. Moreover, the articulation of the agenda in terms of its utility as a tool to effect change operates in accordance with the logic of possibility, but the need to leverage the agenda to realize its own success constitutes it as impossible. Thus, logics of both possibility and impossibility hold this discourse together. The third story accounts for the ways in which failure, limitations, and challenges are narrated in the agenda. The narration of shortcomings in the implementation of the WPS agenda and in the agenda's success more broadly has a consistent structure, especially in the annual reports of the Secretary General. The telling of these stories produces a collective subject jointly responsible for the limitations perceived in the agenda as it stands. We, that collective subject, are all failing WPS at the UN, and this construction reinforces the authority of the UN as well as its culpability as a WPS actor in the stories of these shortcomings. The resolution to the acknowledged shortcomings is often presented as more frequent, more granular monitoring, which reinforces the construction of the agenda itself as a quantifiable knowledge object. The primary discourse in the narrative of failure relates an explanation for the shortcomings of the agenda that focus on a lack of funding or other kinds of resources and a lack of political will. I argue here that the dominant representations of failure in the narratives I examine frequently relate to material failures of implementation, which are in turn attributed to a lack of resources and a lack of political will by the actors in question. I propose that these failure stories or failure rationales are problematic, as political will is so general an explanatory factor as to be impossible to counter, and I develop this argument in line with Jutta Welders' treatment of the national interest. Narrating the failures of the WPS agenda in this way, therefore, constitutes the agenda as a knowable object, the success of which is contingent on the whims of implementing actors. This reinforces a realpolitik vision of the WPS sphere that strengthens a logic of impossibility regarding the enactment of the transformative principles that the agenda purportedly captures. Attributing these shortcomings to failures of resources and political will is somewhat reductive and reproduces the authority of the Council and, to a lesser extent, the UN member states in the institutional architecture of the agenda. There are other discourses at play, however. Of particular significance are discourses about expertise and discourses about the magnitude of the agenda. Broadly speaking, discourses about experts and expertise intersect with discourses on resources and political will, as all construct the United Nations and its staff as an organization that is lacking, in accordance again with the logic of impossibility. In an interesting parallel to the construction of the subject of women in need of protection in early WPS discourse, which I have written about elsewhere, here it is the UN that is lacks sufficient resources, agency, will, and expertise to deliver on the promise of WPS commitments. The discourses marshalled in service of the stories of shortcomings construct the WPS efforts of UN entities and member states as limited at best, hampered by the inefficiencies of a complex and bureaucratic system, and tokenistic at worst, where WPS work is paraded before the Council one day each October on the anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 1325, only to be sidelined for the rest of the year. Unsurprisingly, the Council's authority is reinforced within these discourses, along with a more subtle transfer of power to member states, whose passive or active resistance to aspects of the agenda shapes and influences the shortcomings that are identified, including indirectly through the withholding of resources and political will. The magnitude of the agenda is articulated as a causal factor in the story of WPS failures, in line with the logic of incoherence. Interrogating these discourses reveals that the size or scope of the agenda is widely held to be part of the story of shortcomings, and moreover that this story should account for failures of a different order. These are not failures of resources, will, or expertise, but conceptual failures. Failures to know the agenda as a specified and settled set of principles and practices. The failure of the idea that such certainty is possible, thus reproducing the agenda in accordance with the logic of impossibility. These accounts of failure are often circular and recount the reoccurrence of shortcomings, the need to reiterate or relitigate that which was previously thought to be agreed upon. These discourses surface the plural logics of coherence, incoherence, and possibility, impossibility that I identify as particularly powerful in the narration of the WPS agenda. The fourth story relates tensions and pressure points within the agenda. As I explained, the agenda is usually described in terms of 4 pillars of activity: the participation of women in peace and security governance, the prevention of violence and conflict, the protection of women's rights and bodies, and gender-sensitive relief and recovery. Over time, however, the emphasis given to each of these pillars has varied, and different actors have supported different initiatives under each pillar with different political effects. The story of tension evident in the data I've collected or co-produced through interview is primarily articulated in terms of imbalance, which is in itself interesting as it presupposes the virtue or desirability of balance across the various pillars. This story is comprised of discourse about whether the agenda is settled or not, related though subtly different from the discourse of completeness I discussed a moment ago. Further, tensions and pressure points are politically and strategically deployed as rationales for limited engagement across the agenda as a whole by certain actors, in accordance with logics of possibility and impossibility. The agenda is constituted as unwieldy in scope, too wide-ranging to permit successful implementation. The logics of coherence, incoherence, and possibility, impossibility create constraints around the agenda that are further reinforced through logics of the agenda's location and dislocation. I identify a discourse here that relates to spatial disconnections which animate and organize the agenda, frequently captured in the discursive construction of localization versus national implementation versus transnational advocacy. These connections and disconnections function to diffuse the agenda across contexts, such that it emerges as not only impossibly vast in scope, but also impossible to anchor spatially. The WPS agenda is everything and everywhere, which permits WPS actors to be selective in their practices. It even demands such selectivity. And the final discourse relates to the power of the Security Council. This discourse reproduces several themes I've already discussed. The articulation of a disjuncture between the agenda on paper and the agenda in practice, which is evident in the stories of origins and ownership, and the conceit that the agenda is settled according to an ambivalent logic of practice and logics of coherence-incoherence. There is a set of discourses about the desire or lack thereof for more resolutions, which would fill out and finalize the architecture. These discourses suggest that if only the right words for the new resolutions could be found, then the WPS agenda might live up to its promise. Further, and although these same discourses articulate resolution fatigue, the representation of WPS in these discourses is again of a policy agenda that is at once definitely complete and indefinitely incomplete. The juxtaposition of these two realities is characteristic of the narration of the agenda as a whole. The fifth and final narrative is a story of the specific silences and absences represented in the data I've collected, which have a formative effect on the constitution of the agenda. The common sense of WPS is that these dimensions should be left unspoken, lest they provide cynics and skeptics with critical ammunition to undermine the agenda. Examining these silences and absences as constitutive of the WPS agenda, and therefore as implicated in both its failures and its successes, reinforces the plurality and polyvalences of WPS as it emerges as a knowable policy agenda through its narration. The suppressed frustrations and the barely detectable influences and influencers are as much part of the formation of the agenda as the indicators, audits, and action plans. The first discourse I identify here is about bad data. Although, as I show in my discussion of narratives of success, there are frequent representations of data in narratives of the agenda that attach primary value to quantitative data, this discourse relates specifically to the quality of data relied upon in accounts of the WPS agenda. Underpinned by logics of possibility, impossibility, and coherence, incoherence, this discourse of bad data both sustains the ideal of a coherent and possible agenda and simultaneously undermines this ideal. I explore the story of silences in the agenda through the characterization of WPS experts, who I see as knowers and doers, a formation which is influenced by Sam Cooke's work, in a discourse about individual influence. The ambivalent logic of practice strongly informs this discourse, as do logics of location-dislocation. The experts or knowers are also doers, of course, but through various discursive practice, the experts, knowers, are aligned with UN headquarters as a site of power, with the authority of the UN Security Council, and with the thinking or writing of the agenda into being. The experts, knowers, are also keepers of the agenda's secrets, holders of the silence around the quality of data that is fetishized as evidence of the agenda's success, and invisible architects of many of the political opportunities that have effected significant change. The palimpsest of the agenda, described or tacitly acknowledged in the data I examine, reinforces both discourses of silence and sensibility. The agenda, in all its complexity, is seen by and visible to only a few experts, knowers, less so the doers of WPS. The narratives of silence, in conjunction with the specific sensibility of WPS, again reinforce logics of impossibility. In line with the representation of the agenda as both certain and uncertain, both complete and incomplete, the known and unknown futures of the agenda affect how WPS actors engage with the agenda in the present. There are two strands to this discourse. First, a discourse about intuition reproduces the subjects of experts, knowers, and holds the agenda tightly within the UN system, even exclusively within small pockets of the institution. Second, within that same discourse, within that same system, a discourse about the ambitions of the agenda and the individuals that sustain it impose constraints on the imaginable futures. It cannot take up too much space, be too visible or too demanding. This is a particularly feminized sensibility, I think, and one that intersects also with other feelings coded female, such as being grateful for the opportunities thus far afforded, being cautious not to upset the system, and being restrained in advocacy and other forms of engagement. So, to draw to a close, in this book, I situate the WPS agenda as a form of international policy making and international policy practice constituted in and through the stories that are told about it. And I argue that the narration of the WPS at UN headquarters in New York is part of how it emerges as a knowable policy agenda. The questions motivating this research were quite straightforward. What are the narratives of WPS agenda that are told at and around UN headquarters in New York, site of the UN Security Council, and thus architectural home of the formal elaboration of the agenda? And how do these narratives shape and inform the ways that the agenda is encountered, acted upon, and imagined into this future? The questions were quite straightforward, but the answers to these questions were quite complex. Indeed, complexity is a key part of the answers I've generated through the research presented here. Sorry, my light's gone off. There we go. Holding the discourses of WPS in narrative formation and constituting meaning in and through the discursive practices I examine are four sets of logics. Logics of coherence, incoherence, impossibility, possibility, location, dislocation, and an ambivalent logic of practice. These logics refuse reconciliation, refuse to privilege one side of the presented binary over the other. The discourses that I identify do not produce, in combination or over time, either coherence or incoherence, either possibility or impossibility. They produce both and in all cases. Hence, the logics I identify are intrinsically plural. This is a story about WPS that constitutes the agenda as a coherent set of principles and practices enshrined in UN Security Council resolutions authored by UN member states in consultation with representatives of civil society, of which implementation is possible given the right conditions. But there are numerous other stories that contest and conflict with this account, that show the ambiguity of the agenda's core tenets and trouble that which is taken for granted. And those stories are true also. The agenda is coherent, possible, located within the Council and enshrined within the Council's resolutions, and it is incoherent, impossible, spatially dispersed, and embedded in the practices of multiple actors, advocates, policymakers, practitioners, diplomats. It is both and all of these things, and there is value in recognizing this plurality, this complexity, as constitutive of WPS as a policy agenda. Surfacing the plurality of these logics means that those working on and around the agenda must necessarily give up on the illusion that the agenda is or ever can be conceived of as singular and thus manageable, coherent, possible. There is no singular, authentic, real and true WPS agenda. There are inevitably competing and often conflicting claims and counterclaims about the agenda's principles and priorities. Some of these are more persuasive than others, and some aspects of the agenda are widely accepted among the WPS epistemic community as having been codified within the agenda's artifact. But even these cannot be simply ported from resolution to program delivery site, for example. Interpretation and translation is always required. In this research, I aim to show how the narratives of the WPS agenda are organized according to plural and undecidable logics, and I argue that this plurality, the actually existing complexity of the agenda, cannot, indeed should not, be used as an alibi for limited action or strategic inaction. It is complicated. The agenda is complicated, but that cannot, should not, deflect or diminish sustained engagement with the agenda in its infinite complexity, its infinite intrinsic plurality. The political logics I identify resist efforts to close down or narrow the meaning of WPS as a policy agenda in global politics. And so effective political engagement, the realization of the agenda, depends on sitting with and finding productive potential in multiple and ambivalence. As one research participant commented during our conversation, you have to go beyond the simple definition, but I don't see where this is a problem. The Women, Peace and Security agenda for me has room to capture all of this. I feel like I've probably talked for long enough. I'm very grateful for your time, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, so much for sharing with us your knowledge regarding the WPS agenda. And it was such an inspiring argument, and I'm really eager to read the book. I've read some other works of you, and they're so inspiring. So I really want to thank you for your contribution here. I'll just say a few words here in Portuguese just to like organize the logistics, but you can also see and feel the love from our audience with the comments here. I will try to put all of the comments here. But thank you so much. Então, pessoal, quem tiver perguntas, pode ficar à vontade, colocar aqui no chat, seja em inglês ou em português, e aí eu passo para a Laura. Enquanto isso, eu vou apresentar uma pergunta que eu pensei. So, Laura, I was thinking about some other arguments that you made in the past. You basically found that most of the like global North national action plans were like outwards, right? Reproducing what you said, that the problems happen elsewhere, but the problem is here. Additionally to that, Columba, I think it's Aquielosaro, but I'm not quite sure, argue that, and I quote, this observation echoes Nicola Pratt, who reads the Resolution 1325 against Gayatri Spivak's often sitting observation about colonialism as white men saving brown women from brown men. And while I was listening to you, I was thinking about who could narrate the WPS agenda. What part, like, who could narrate, or could it be understood, or do you understand it like global, North white male savior complex, some kind of thing, but what kind of bodies and what kind of arguments can be made, and by whom, in regard with the WPS agenda? And yeah, I think that's the main question I have here, and I'll start to collect the questions, and I will also share all the love and good energy that people are sending to you. So yeah, please feel free to comment.
Sure. Thank you, Vinicius. That's a really important question. And one, honestly, that I don't think I did justice to in the book itself. I do talk in the opening pages of the book about the partiality of the analysis that I offer. So I'm very clear to kind of, I guess, examine a little bit my own complicity in reproducing the agenda as situated in the United Nations headquarters, authored by those entities that are involved in WPS storytelling in the place that I chose to look for it, right? But there's a really significant and important body of research now that looks at the ways that WPS is being articulated across multiple other sites, very kind of locally within community and grassroots organizations of women doing peace work, within their communities. They are telling their own WPS stories, right? And although I didn't have the scope within this project to undertake the kinds of like extensive analysis that it would have taken to do justice to the kind of diversity of ways in which WPS is articulated in all of those different contexts. There is, you know, that is too much even for just one person to do at any time, right? So what I'm so grateful for is working in community with all of these amazing scholars like Nicola Pratt, Columba, you know, Tony Hastrup, Maria Martin de Almagro, Paula Drummond, like there's lots of scholars who are working on WPS and looking at how WPS is being articulated in different contexts, you know. So like if I want to know what are the WPS stories, you know, of women doing peace work in India, for example, Shumita Basu and Shweta Singh are both working, you know, on those topics. And similarly, you know, if I want to know about how WPS is articulated in Congo or in Brazil or, you know, anywhere, there are feminist scholars doing this incredible work that I'm learning from all the time, right? And I'm learning how those stories are told and articulated in these different ways that are then, you know, maybe the same, maybe not. Like the logics of those discourses and stories might be the same, they might be different, but we can't know unless we investigate. So I'm very clear that the work that I've done is only about the reproduction within that institution of global governance, right? It is only the way that those stories are told within the UN headquarters. So I'm very careful not to say that I have like insight into like the real truth of WPS because I did this work with the United Nations, because it is only a very small fraction actually of the WPS work that happens. So yeah, it's a really important question, and you know, I love it because it gives me the opportunity to, you know, amplify the work of my incredible colleagues who are doing this really important research in these different contexts, you know, for various reasons, including the fact that, you know, I have a small, well, no longer so small, but I have a child, so I haven't really wanted to do extensive fieldwork myself for a long time now. So, you know, I'm really glad that there are other colleagues out there who are able to do that research for me to learn from, for us all to learn from.
Yes, thank you. We have like so many questions. I don't think we'll be able to get them all, but I have one here from, let me just, okay. Jessica, Professor Jessica has one question here. How do you see the question of culture and difference in this agenda? Is it one of the discourses of silence? What are the outcomes of WPS agenda narrative for women in non-Western global South?
There's, again, like, it's a really important question. Thank you. And I would say, you know, having paid very close attention over the last sort of 20 years to the development of the agenda, the question of diversity in the subject of women is not one that the agenda has grappled well with. Like, attention to representation and diversity is not like the Security Council's, you know, comfortable space, let's be honest. But, you know, we've seen increasingly the emergence of some discourse in national action plans and regional action plans and implementation protocols. We've seen some beginnings of gestures towards the recognition, for example, of intersectionality and the different ways in which women are differently positioned, whether it's, you know, rural and urban women, or whether it's racialized or minoritized women within particular contexts. You know, the question of which women are being included and who is authorized to speak is beginning to emerge as a really important side of contestation within the agenda, I think, beyond the council. So for engagement with these questions of culture and difference, I wouldn't look at the stories that I investigate, actually. I would look beyond the council at those kind of sites of implementation that I was talking about earlier, and, you know, to investigate how even, you know, the kind of liberal democracies are beginning to at least pay kind of token recognition to questions of intersectional experience and diversity among women, recognizing that actually it matters which women we're involving and how diverse that community is. So yes, I think in implementation, it is a question of looking in those sort of domestic and national contexts.
Okay. We have a question here from our student, Ana Laura. To what extent has the WPS agenda been able to promote significant changes in the maintenance of peace security, specifically for women in more vulnerable conditions? There's a second part here, such as women from the global south, Black and queer.
So I think, again, like, this is a really important question. I'm actually very ambivalent about claiming that the agenda does anything, right? I think that, for me at least, it doesn't make sense to talk of the agenda, because it is so complex and so varied, so plural, that the agenda cannot be, you know, it can't be attributed with like creating conditions for successful change, but also it can't be held responsible for not fixing everything, right? Because there's all kinds of other things that are terrible and causing discrimination and harm and inequality and injustice. But I think that there are certain practices that are undertaken in the name of women, peace and security that have, you know, had a positive impact. We have, you know, now we have much more accountability for sexual violence crimes in conflict affected settings. We have, you know, the emergence of really quite a strong norm that women should be involved in peace processes. But again, it matters which women we're talking about, right? Because if it is only, you know, foreign educated, elite, urban women that are consistently approached to participate in these processes, then we're going to reproduce the same kinds of structural inequalities that kept all women away from those processes in the first place, right? So I think, you know, my answer to this question, you know, and I am often asked some version of this question, which really boils down to, like, what is it good for anyway? My answer to this question is always, like, some good things have been achieved in the name of the agenda by those that are working with it. I think in community organizations, you know, at the really local level, you know, but it is also used to do harm. Like, let's not overlook the extent to which the WPS agenda is used to is used to justify the increased militarization of societies. And, you know, one of the most kind of prominent critiques of the WPS agenda is the extent to which it is actually, you know, used to defend the kind of militarism of liberal democracies, you know, and actors like the UK and Canada and Sweden, they continue to invest in arms, they continue to sell arms, they continue to contribute to the overall insecurity while still claiming to be champions of the women, peace and security agenda, which is just makes my head hurt. The tension within that, right? So we always need to be attentive to not only, you know, what good is the agenda doing, but also how is it being used to do harm, right? How is it perpetuating certain kinds of injustices and inequalities? So I guess my answer is, as always, it's complicated, but, like, I mean, for me, that's not a bad thing, because it means there's always more to learn, right? There's always more research to do and always more to look at.
Sure, yes. I have here another question from Professor Barbara. She says here, as you state in the book, the plurality of perspectives cannot be an excuse for inaction. So to what extent do current narratives point to effective strategies for gender-sensitive approaches?
I think that strategies, like the agenda has so many strategies. It has so many indicators and so many kind of plans and objectives and goals and, you know, so many things to measure and kind of markers of success. But I'm really not sure that it's all that effective, right? So I mean, I think the idea of any kind of top-down implementation strategy for gender sensitizing any kind of peace and security governance mechanism or practice, I feel like that is not going to work, frankly, because I think, you know, what I've learned through this research, but also most of the other research that I'm involved in on WPS, is that context really matters. That whether we're talking about, and like, I don't just mean kind of global North, global South context, minority world, majority world, like, I mean, like, even within the UN, whether you're talking to people in DPPA or DPO, right? Whether you're talking to people in the development program or the peace building support office, like, context matters in those instances as well. Because what is effective in one context, even within that organization, is not going to be the same, because their drivers and their objectives are different. So in terms of developing effective strategies for implementation and gender sensitization, they have to be deeply contextually embedded, and they have to be like fluid, I guess, and adaptable to those different contexts. And I think that's true whether we're talking across the organization, across the, you know, nationally, and even within countries, like different community contexts. Obviously, they are important also.
Okay. We have here, actually, it's a part of a question from Sophia. So she said, good evening, Professor Shepard. I'm currently writing my graduate thesis on the role of transnational social movements for women's rights in the creation of women, peace, and security agenda. And then, because of many comments, the question came later. What is the importance of organized civil society in transforming the discourses and narrative, and therefore the whole logic that dictates the political agenda of the UN concerning gender debates?
Well, first of all, I would really love to read the thesis, because I'm very interested in the civil society advocacy and activism around the agenda. That's why, like, I devoted like a whole chapter of the book to this. But also, you know, I feel very strongly that civil society engagement with the agenda is like an inescapable part of what the agenda is. Like, this is my interpretation of it, but my work on the agenda always has shown me how powerful civil society mobilization is in supporting and pushing forward the agenda, and constantly pushing everybody involved with the agenda to be better, right? So for me, civil society, and I've written a little bit about this, I guess I have two things to say. One is that civil society engagement with the agenda is a critical part of accountability. So it may be that the Security Council gets to adopt the resolutions, and therefore the Security Council is in charge of the agenda. But the civil society, whether it's at the United Nations or, you know, within national politics, civil society engagement is what keeps political actors accountable, right? And so I think that the significance of civil society in transforming what the agenda is and how it is done is really, really important. It's very high, I guess, that significance. And the other thing I would say is that I worked on another book last year, which is a much smaller book, with some colleagues. And we talked about the way that civil society engages with the WPS agenda. We theorized it as a form of care labor. So that is actually an act of care. It's an act of love. The work that civil society organizations do to sustain the agenda, because these organizations feel so engaged and responsible for the agenda, such a, you know, as an important part of the agenda's origins. You know, it's an act of love for these organizations to keep the agenda going and to keep caring for it. So we wrote a much smaller book about how, you know, it really is civil society organizations that make 1325 work. And like I said, we talk about it in terms of care labor and care work. And I think that for me, this is the way that I have increasingly come to understand how civil society engages with the agenda, and it is from a place of care and from a place of love, which I find politically really important to kind of acknowledge, actually.
Yes. Okay. Let me just say here in Portuguese for the students. Pessoal, está resolvendo a questão do formulário, ele vai ficar aberto por mais um pouquinho de tempo, então não vai, vou colocar aqui o link, tá? Podem ficar tranquilos. So Laura, I think that was our last question. We have like a little bit over an hour. We had like a peak of 200 and I think 20 people watching, and it's 177 right now. So I can only thank you because it's really an amazing opportunity that we have here, and that to engage with you and to talk with you, because I mean, we've worked in other contexts, and it's been such a pleasure. And I think you truly like inspired many students today, and myself, but myself is like as usual, and others I think maybe inspired as well. Let me just put Professor here, Pericles again. Okay, he was right here with us all the time. So I can only thank you so much for engaging with us. Sophia, let Laura know about your research. I think that's the main point, right? I mean, to connect people. So I thank you very much for your time, and I'm sending all the love to Australia. I don't know if you've heard, but my dog was like barking a little bit, so I think it's the loudest that he ever barked, because he barked from Brazil and people could hear from Australia. So it was really loud. But thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we can meet again in person in Brazil, Australia, ISA, and so on.
It was truly my pleasure. Thank you so much for creating this space. Thank you, everybody who connected in and asked such brilliant questions. You know, if you have any questions you want to follow up, you know, you can Google me. My email is very easy to find. I'm really happy to hear from anybody working in this space. You know, like, it's been a tough couple of years for everybody, right? But one of the things that has come out of it is that we've begun to use these technologies to connect more effectively, and it gets me, you know, to be able to, you know, zoom in to talk to you all and connect with you all, you know, on a rainy Tuesday morning. So I'm really honored and delighted to have been able to spend this time with you, and I hope we can do it again sometime. That was really lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please be safe, and anytime we are together. Thank you so much. You have a nice day, and for us a nice evening.
Yes,
here.
have a good evening, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Very important and necessary. It's a great, interesting presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. And yes, if you have any questions or you want to follow up on anything, anybody, just feel free to drop me an email. But I'll be around.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you. You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye.